Hello, my lovely archaeogastronomers. Welcome back to another episode of The Delicious Legacy. With me, your host, Thomas Dinas. Lovely to have you back. On this episode, I would like to go back to ancient Greece, to the classical period, and obviously talk about some not so well-known aspects of the Greek food back then. Of course, over the years, I've been dipping in and out of the ancient Greco-Roman world, and the Hellenistic period, and the wider area of the Greek sphere of influence. And this pan-Mediterranean melting pot with Carthaginians, Romans, Greeks, Etruscans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and all the other people and nations dotted across Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. And of course the Black Sea too, because Greeks had many colonies there too. I've been dipping in and out, and we've explored a lot of not used ingredients today from the Greek cuisine. We've seen garum, we've seen asafoetida or silphium, we've talked about different sauces, Archestratus' love for fish, and all that stuff. I would like on this episode to focus, to zoom in into specific things, specific ingredients or foods or styles of eating that they were important for one reason or another in the ancient Greek world, primarily of mainland Greece and Sicily and the Minor Asia, the coastal towns and cities of what is today Turkey. The ancient Greeks who lived on these places were very much part of the center of the Greek world, and 2,500 years ago, and that means we have at least some indication of some foods and some wines and drinks and why they were eating and drinking this type of things. And again, it's difficult to define specific, if it was something very specific for the region, the town, the city, or it was something only the aristocracy or the middle classes or the poor people ate. And it's the distinction that we have there. Obviously, it's tricky to find. Generally speaking, the things that we know of from literature and evidence, archaeological evidence, tends to point to the more aristocratic and upper classes. But let's explore some specific things and see what we will discover on today's episode. But before we go to our episode proper, let me thank all of you who are subscribed to Patreon and Ko-Fi. And please keep coming. I need your support and your help there. So if you can afford £5 to donate on Ko-Fi, so if you go ko-fi.com/The Delicious Legacy Podcast, donate £5 to help the podcast grow. And if you go to Patreon, patreon.com/The Delicious Legacy, you can be a subscriber, a patron there from $3 a month and above, and you can help this podcast with the costs and expenses and help it grow. Other than that, please listen and share with friends, colleagues, family. Text your friends, talk to your family and colleagues, and tell them this interesting podcast is out. And I've got lots of interviews with authors of the history of different food items and countries and dishes and so on. And also, I'm trying to do a lot of research in ancient dishes and recipes. So please share far and wide and listen on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and rate and review as well. That makes a lot of difference when it comes to small independent podcasts that we don't have support or backing from big media corporations. Okay, that's all for me. Let's go back to our episode. And I think I'll start with some wines or some style of wines and some drinking paraphernalia. to whet our appetites for some food. Anthosmias. It's a style of wine in which a proportion of seawater was added to the must before the fermentation. This contributed to a very distinct aroma and flavor, and more importantly, must have helped to prevent the spoilage of the wine during transportation. As we know, it was transported in amphorae and usually with the ships across the Mediterranean world. Now, this method of making wine was used also for another one we will see later on, called Koan wine. And of course, other cheap wines from the eastern Aegean Sea. Critically, wines intended for export. So the term anthosmias literally means flower-scented and is used by Athenaeus of Eresus, who gives brief instructions for making the product. An alternative and most honest name was oinos tethalassomenos, i.e. brine wine. So the Koan wine I mentioned earlier is from the island of Kos in the eastern Aegean. So this is now the southern Dodecanese islands near Rhodes. Koan wine was not specifically important in the classical Athens, if we judge its absence from the list of wines mentioned in the various Greek comedies. Its success appears to have come from the addition of seawater to the mast at the beginning of fermentation, and this was first done, according to Pliny, so we're talking now going to the Roman period, and according to Pliny, it was first done by a cheating slave who added seawater to make up the amount of mast he was expected to produce each day. And this feature of Koan is confirmed by Dioscorides and Athenaeus, our later writers of the Greco-Roman world, and the demand for Koan spread extremely rapidly in the 3rd century BCE and after. Already in the mid-2nd century, Cato, in distant Rome, is providing a detailed recipe for the imitation of Koan wine. And this includes seawater or brine as available, and directs that the amphorae must be left for 4 years in the sun to mature. The result might have resembled the rancio wines of the modern Languedoc-Roussillon Mid-Pyrénées wines, which are far cry from many modern northern wines. It has a unique flavor and is drunk usually as an aperitif to accompany tapas or salted anchovies. So this rancio wines refers to the wines aging in partially filled barrels, an environment that favors oxidization. And in order to cultivate pleasing flavors in these surroundings, it is essential that the wine has high alcohol content. But that's a speculation, of course, and something that Andrew Dalby talks about. So how much of it is true, it will be an interesting thing to find out. So in the following centuries of the popularity of the Koan and its imitations, we can trace the spread of the amphorae of Koan type. So this amphora, which is the clay vessels that carry goods around the Mediterranean, Koan wine is never listed among fine wines, either in Latin or Greek sources, with one exception. A prescription for wobbly teeth, apparently, quoted by Galen, the physician, from Heraclitus of Tarentum, calls for the best Koan as an alternative to wine from Chios. And so apart from this, Galen saw garrulous on wines of the Eastern Mediterranean Aegean in the 2nd century, never mentions Koan wine at all. And the salting of wines is considered unwholesome, according to him. So apart from the amphorae, which we could break easily, there was something else, another container for wine called kuleus, and it's the whole skin of an ox sealed to form a container for the wine. And when it was to be distributed by road, more often actually in the Italian peninsula than in Greece, wine was perhaps usually packed in this way, as earthenware containers would be much more heavier and will have a risk of breaking. So the kuleus was a standard measure of liquid volume containing 20 amphorae or 960 sextari or 525 liters. Cato explains a method of filling a wineskin to this standard measure, as a farmer would need to do when selling wine in bulk. And the advantages of an ox skin as temporary storage device for wine were apart from the lightness and the resilience, the ability to collapse it as its contents are gradually sold. So empties, you collapse a little bit, empties more, collapse a little bit more. And during the distribution process, the wine that remained was thus not brought into contact with air. In a sense, kind of a modern day bag-in-a-box wine has the same advantages. You are listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. A favorite of the ancients were aphrodisiacs, so foods that will help with your arousal in bed, let's say. So Greeks and Romans had a long list of these, and let's make here a warning and a caveat that modern pharmacologists and modern medicine regards almost all of them as clinically ineffective, so don't try it at home, basically. That's what I'm saying. It's not like it won't give you any potency. Some appear to be in the list because they resemble sexual organs. For example, the grape hyacinth bulbs, or carrots, or leeks, and even other stuff, other roots. Or another reason for appearing in the list is because of the viscosity of the juices, which resemble that of, the bodily fluids like semen and stuff. Examples of this kind are shellfish, especially oysters, and snails and eggs. And Heraclides of Tarendum gives an explanation for the use of these three as aphrodisiacs. Also, perhaps terebinth fruits, since they are so rich in oil. Others have a physical effect on the urinary system, like wild chervil or rocket leaves and nettles and peppers, or black peppercorn in a sense, or a general psychological effect like wine, which removes your inhibitions, and even myrrh, because its aroma suggested the festivities. Some of these ancient aphrodisiacs, notably satyrion and bulbs, retain their reputation in parts of the Greco-Italian psyche and tradition today. Apicius provides recipes for bulbs. So we have several recipes that include extract from a lost work of Varro, asserting their aphrodisiac effect. Aphrodisiac medicines prescribed by ancient physicians, they were prescribed to combat frigidity or impotence, sometimes took the form of simple preparations that incorporated 2 or 3 of the accepted aphrodisiac foods. For example, the strengthening of foods prescribed for a case of impotence in Petronius Satyricon are bulbs and snails served without sauce and a little unmixed wine. And sometimes, by contrast, physicians prepared extremely complicated compound drugs that included many exotic ingredients. Ritual observances were sometimes required in the course of gathering aphrodisiac herbs or preparing aphrodisiac medicines. And an obvious point of resemblance between aphrodisiacs, on the one hand, and on the other, those magical potions and spells whose purpose was to attract or retain the sexual attention of a particular person. So several foods were regarded as having an aphrodisiac effect. This included cannabis seed, the seed of the chaste tree, rue, cress, and lettuce. Bizarrely, I don't know. It is because of this property that ordinary meals of lettuce were customarily served with rocket, which was believed to neutralize it. So, anti-aphrodisiac, I suppose. Red mullet, as daughter of the virgin goddess Artemis, was believed to be anti-aphrodisiac, according to the comic gastronomic poem by Plato Comicus, which also mentions several of the better-known aphrodisiacs. In confirmation of this, a lost work by Terpsichores, called On Sex, Periaphrodisian, listed wine in which a red mullet has drowned as an anti-aphrodisiac and contraceptive. Terpsichores also listed sparrows as an aphrodisiac food because sparrows breed rapidly. The apple was an important element in cookery, in medicine, and also in love charms in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE in the Near East. Wild apples, crab apples of the European wild species, gradually spread from the northern Anatolia after the last ice age. Apples were in due course transplanted or grown from seed far to the south of their native habitat in Mesopotamia in particular, where strings of sliced dried apples are described in literary sources and have been found by archaeologists. In Greece, the apple was a typical orchard fruit, at least from the Odyssey, so circa 700 BCE onwards. Early dietary writings such as the Hippocratic regimen discouraged the eating of fresh apples, although the juice of cooked apples is prescribed in Epidemics, Book 7. Apples were stored for winter use, as Aristophanes suggests, but possibly in dried rather than fresh form, just as in earlier Mesopotamia. From around 600 BCE, there was already one sweet variety, glycymelon, so sweet apple, mentioned by Sappho and after her in poetic tradition by Callimachus and Meleager. By the time of the naturalist Theophrastus, 310 BCE, grafting was certainly familiar and many cultivated kinds of apple were known. Alexander the Great found best apples growing in Babylonia, so Harris says. 3 centuries later, Roman growers were active in the development of new varieties, several of which could be stored throughout the winter months. Whether this was a tradition they've copied from the Greeks, the Hellenistic kingdoms, or the Carthaginians is not clear. Greek melon, the word for apple, in the narrowest sense meant apple or quince. In a wider sense, it included all round fleshy tree fruits, such as pomegranates and, in due course, peaches and citrons. The Latin malum meant apple, but poets gave it the same broader sense as the Greek equivalent. Thus, incidental references to Latin malum, Greek melon, might intend any or all of these fruits and do not necessarily point to apples particularly. In particular, the apples of classical myth, the golden apples of Hesperides, or the apple that distracted Atalanta in her race against matrimony, and other various symbolic of love and health, might be pomegranates after all, or quinces, or various other types as the interpreter or the sculpture preferred, just as well as apples, really. As I mentioned earlier, the bulbs of the grape hyacinth, which in Greek is translated as volvae, are known in modern Greek as well as volvae, and in Italian as lampascioni. These have been eaten in Greece ever since classical times as an appetizer or relish. They require long baking, traditionally under hot ashes, and generous seasoning, an expenditure of effort possibly redeemed by their lasting fame as aphrodisiacs. Megara, the town near Athens in Attica, was the traditional producer for the Athenian market. Bulbs were no less popular in classical Italy. The strengthening foods prescribed for a case of impotence in Petronius Satyricon are bulbs, snails served without sauce, and a little unmixed wine, as we've seen earlier. Ovid confirms the aphrodisiac reputation of bulbs, as does the Uxorius Varro, quoted thus in a recipe book by Apicius. Bulbs. Serve in oil, fish sauce, vinegar with a little cumin sprinkled over. Or mash and boil in water, then fry in oil. Make a sauce thus: thyme, pennyroyal, pepper, oregano, honey, a little vinegar, and if liked, a little fish sauce. Sprinkle pepper over and serve. Or boil and squeeze into a pan, adding thyme, oregano, honey, vinegar, concentrated must, dates, fish sauce, and a little oil. Sprinkle pepper over and serve. Varro says, "What of bulbs? Boil them in water," I said, "if you fancy knocking at Venus's door. Or serve them at dinner, as people do at proper weddings. But you might add pine kernels or pounded rocket and pepper." Galen suggests a comparable variety of cooking methods. The flavor of bulbs, though somewhat bitter even at the end of the cooking process, was sufficiently attractive that bulbs were often combined with other foods. For example, a dish called volvofake, bulb and lentil soup, served, for whatever good reason, at the courtesan's establishment in one Greek anecdote from Lynceus. In this particular combination, they were found to confer a general feeling of warmth. An ancient proverb recorded by Chrysippus, "Bulb and lentil soup is like ambrosia when the cold weather bites." In addition to the uses of whole bulbs as food and aphrodisiac, the juice of bulbs had medicinal uses. As specified, for example, in Hippocratic texts. There's a spiny Near Eastern plant grown for its buds and small fruits. both of which can be pickled, cured, and used as relish. I'm talking about capers and caper berries. In some cuisines, there are also a culinary flavoring incorporated in the course of the cooking. This was perhaps rare in the Greek and Roman cuisine. The Stoic philosopher Zeno swore by the caper, says the Suda, as Socrates swore by the dog. And Suda is a large 10th century AD Byzantine encyclopedia of the ancient Mediterranean world. It was supposed to be from somebody called Sudas, that's why it's called the Suda. But it's basically compiled from ancient sources that now have been lost. So it's like a lexicon written in Greek with roughly 30,000 entries. Archaeological evidence suggests that the capers were collected at Frankthi cave in Peloponnese by 7000 BCE. The Frankthi cave is basically an archaeological site overlooking the Kyllada Bay near the Argolic Gulf in southern Greece, in Peloponnese, in the Argolid region where you have Argos, the ancient city of Argos and all that. So humans seem to occupy this area for tens of thousands of years. So we have the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages. And it's been continuously occupied, this large cave. And there we find lots of tools and evidence of year-round occupation and living in this cage, especially in the Neolithic time, so roughly around 7,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE. So they have stone tools and knives and millstones and axes, lots of organic material, fish hooks and spatulas, and there's lots of food as well left there to disintegrate. So yeah, we have a lot of stuff there inside that cave that tell us the history, or actually the prehistory of people in mainland Greece, basically. Caper bush loves to grow in stony coastal lines. It tolerates the salt and the salinity of the soil and the poor soil and the hot weather. So these capers continue to be gathered from the wild throughout classical times. A character in the comedy by Timocles, talking about the famous Athenian hetera, tells us the following. I fell in love with Phryne when she was still gathering capers. Now, whether he means it literally or metaphorically of the lady herself, the status of capers as wild food sold cheaply as street stalls is clear. And as Aristotle points out, caper bushes grow apparently in inhospitable places, such as among tombstones, for example, and do not respond well to cultivation. Columella gives instructions for planting them, but only in districts where they are not found growing wild. They are specifically mentioned as a food in the Epic of Gilgamesh, so going back a few thousand years before the classical Greece. Capers are also mentioned in the Bible, as well as several other ancient texts, religious and otherwise. The primary product of the plant, as we said, is the unopened flower bud, and it's bitter and astringent. And one way to read the buds of this bitterness is that they are cured in salt or pickled in salt and vinegar brine. Capers, as I said, love these wild places to grow, and they love ruins. Feral bushes growing nowadays among the gigantic stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, in Jerusalem's Old City, in Athens, crawling up the walls of Acropolis Hill, and in Andalusia in the garden walkways of the Alhambra. Some of the most notable caper-producing regions today include the Sicily in Italy, and the island of Sicily is famous for its capers, which are often used in traditional dishes like pasta alla norma. In Lesbos in Greece, the island of Lesbos is known for its high-quality capers and used throughout Greek cuisine in salads and in tacos and so on. And in the coastal Aegean region of Turkey, home to many caper farms, which produce a variety of caper sizes and flavors. You are listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. A very interesting food is also cress, the garden plant, and it was used for its young, hot-tasting leaves, and it was produced at all times of the year, and they had mustard-like seeds. The cress was well known to classical Greeks, but the best-known fact about it was that it was a typical food of the Persians, the food which young Persians used as a relish alongside their bread, unless success in the hunt meant they had meat instead. Both Dioscurides and Pliny state that the best kind of cress is the Babylonian. Though easy to grow elsewhere, the plant had thus continued to be associated with the Middle East throughout several centuries. Cress, according to Pliny, is antaphrodisiac and sharpens the senses, clearing the vision and calming a troubled mind. Numerous other medicinal uses are listed. So cress in Greek is cardamom, a word probably borrowed from a Middle Eastern language like Assyrian called kudimu. In Latin is nasturtium, which appears to be nose to east from the immediate effect of tasting leaves, a property also alluded in Aristophanic comedy. The identification is certain on this respect, but it seems like sometimes it's confused with the term cardamom, which is completely different spice from the Middle East, not a herb. Moving to more fishy matters, eel was very important, the European river fish that breeds in the Atlantic, in the Sargasso Sea. Eel was one of the most sought after of the ancient delicacies. For some reason, it is also described as one of the most deadly of foods, in a view cited by the Hippocratic text Sacred Disease. Archaeogastronomers tells us that the best eel was at Rhegium, but also from the Lake Opais in Boeotia, Viotia, and from the river Strymon in Macedonia. According to Aristotle, the eel fishing there took place at the rising of the Pleiades, when the water was troubled and muddy. From Kopais, eels came in large baskets to the Athenian market. Kopais is a now extinct lake. It's been drained in historical times to become farmland. The question of how there could be eels in a landlocked lake like Kopais is an interesting one, since all eels migrate between sea and fresh water. Eels must have reached the lake and departed from it to breed by the way of the underground river Kifissus or some other underground passages perhaps. Eels were not farmed, and the job of heliotrophy, the eel keepers in Aristotle's time, was to transfer the eels from river or lake to tanks, thus eventually transporting them to market over considerable distances and keeping them healthy meanwhile. They must be sold absolutely fresh, if not already cooked or cured. Eel could be fine and nourishing food, Galen advises, but you must find out where it was caught and test it for freshness by look and smell. Eel could be cooked in beet leaves or chopped and grilled on a skewer. Grey mullet was an important group of sea and river fish. Newly caught grey mullet provided much appreciated and fairly expensive food along Mediterranean coastlines. The marine grey mullet was the best, says Xenocrates. However, the grey mullet of the Nile was extensively salted and was familiar well beyond the borders of Egypt. The grey mullet was to be bought in Aegina, Abdera and Sinope, according to Archaeogastronomers. It was the best in autumn, as Dorion, Lynceus and Xenocrates agree. Aristotle describes how grey mullet were caught off the coast of Phoenicia, the males taken when they cluster around a previously trapped female. The proper way to cook this prized fish is specified in a play by Athenaeus. The mullet, which has fasted for a whole day and night, nicely sealed, sprinkled with salt, turned out flat, well browned, as one reaching the end of his race is now sizzling and shrieking, while a boy stands by to sprinkle him with vinegar, and the crushed stalk of silphium from Libya is at hand to aid with its divine rays. The reference to fasting in this quotation takes up one of the alternative names for grey mullet in Greek, nestis, literally faster. Athenaeus gives numerous examples of literary play based on this name, which his speakers explain from the fact that the grey mullet has a vegetarian diet and will not take a live bait. Greek kestreus is the commonest term for the grey mullet species. When used generally, it covers the whole group. Some authors, however, use lefkos or lefkiskos as general terms for the group. There were numerous names for the grey mullet in Greek. Only those used in food context are listed now. Athenaeus had a few terms in his Deipnosophistai. European hare of the genus Lepus, the lagomorph, is also an important animal in Greek food writing, especially since it was the largest game animal likely to be encountered near Athens. Most of Xenophon's brief manual of hunting is in fact about hunting the hare, and hair has therefore a prestigious food, a typical lover's gift, as seen in vase paintings of the 6th and 5th century BC, a fine presentation for a dinner or an intimate supper. A recipe is given by Archaeogastronomers, his only surviving instruction of a meat dish, and it says, there are many ways, many rules of preparation of hare. This is the best, that you should bring the roast meat in and serve to everyone while they are drinking, hot, simply sprinkled with salt, taking it from the spit while it's a little rare. Do not worry if you see the ichor sipping from the meat, but eat greedily. To me the other recipes are altogether out of place. Gluey sauce, too much cheese, too much oil over, as if one were cooking a weasel. In Roman Italy, the position of hare was different. Larger game in the form of wild boar was available close to Rome. Hares were farmed, giving their name in fact to leporaria, enclosures in which not only hares but other wild animals might be kept. Both these reasons help to explain why hare was less prestigious as food in Rome than in earlier Greece. It was, however, recommended by dietitians as by Athenaeus here. Hares, if they are quite young, can be taken with a sweet sauce including pepper, a little cloves and ginger, seasoned with patchouli and spikenard. Here, hare is an excellent food, good in case of dysentery, and its bile can be taken, mixed with pepper, for earache. In Greek cuisine, and we're talking about ancient Greek cuisine, the offal and blood of hare were prepared separately in the traditional dish mimarchis, briefly described by Pollux. Canvalos, one of the contributions of the Lydian people to Greek cuisine. That's another interesting food. Supposed to be a luxury dish that came in 3 forms. Again, that's according to our friend Athenaeus in Deipnosophistai. So one of these forms of the dish was a sweet, and it's described by one source as a kind of plakous, or a cake in our modern words. A second was apparently a savory consisting of meat and the broth of a meat with breadcrumbs, so I guess thickened. And Athenaeus gives a brief recipe for this, and this brief description comes from, in the quotes of Athenaeus, he's quoting Hegesippus of Tarentum, another Greek author of Greek cookery and cake making from the 4th century BCE. So he apparently says, the Lydians used also to speak of a dish called kanthalos, of which there were 3 varieties, not one merely. So exquisitely equipped were they for luxurious indulgence. Hegesippus of Tarentum says that it was made of boiled meat, breadcrumbs, Phrygian cheese, anise, and a fatty broth. So Phrygia, in the classical antiquity, was another kingdom in the west-central part of Anatolia. So if you think the mainland Turkey nowadays, where the Sangarios River is, somewhere there basically. Now obviously the problem is what these 2 kinds of kanthalos have in common with one another, and what the third one is. What we have from the literature doesn't clear this at all. And also the term kanthalos appears to be related to Lydian words recorded by Hipponax and Herodotus in the past. Very intriguing, very mysterious, and that's all we know from kanthalos. I finally want to conclude this short compendium with the recognition of local specialties and local food excellence, which appears to be something of an ancient Greek innovation, balanced by the equally novel idea that food preferences also vary from place to place. So several lists of local fine produce are quoted by Athenaeus from texts of the 6th to 4th century BCE, so in a sense 500 to 600 years before Athenaeus wrote his Deipnosophistai. A summary list of the best known specialties is given also by Julius Pollux in the late 2nd century AD on the basis of earlier texts, and he goes something like this. You must know that the ancients approved moray eel from the straits from Tartessus, tuni from Tyre, Kestraeus grey mullet from Skiathos, kid from Milos, shellfish from Cape Pelorus, which is how the shellfish now called Pelorides got their name, beet from Askra, sprats from Lipara, turnips from Andinia, scallops from Methymna, dogfish from Rhodes, flatfish from Eleusis, Aphiaea from Phalerum, red mullet from Ixon, Copaic eels from Boeotia, floaters, i.e. Mori eels from Sicily, Thasian brine, Thasian radishes, Kynthian and Cilician cheese, and salt from Tragasae in the Mars near Troy. All right, I hope you enjoyed this little interesting episode about ancient Greek dishes and food items, our little compendium. And I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. I'll see you again next week with another archaeogastronomical adventure. Love you lots. Goodbye.